No one aboard the threshold array had a name for what they were looking at, because nothing like it had ever needed a name before. The array's long-range cartography suite, a piece of instrumentation so old it had been calibrated against star charts drawn before the current Vithari dynasty had risen to power, had spent the last 11 hours refusing to reconcile its own data. It kept insisting, with the patient, maddening persistence of a machine that has no capacity for doubt, that a spiral structure of several hundred billion stars, complete with a luminous core, sweeping arms, and a faint and steady gravitational signature, existed in a region of intergalactic space where the last survey, conducted 4,000 years earlier, had found nothing but a thin scattering of rogue hydrogen and the ancient, cooling husk of a single dead star. Nothing lived there. Nothing could live there, or so every survey before this one had confidently insisted. It was the void between galaxies, the vast and lightless gulf that every spacefaring civilization in the Council's long history had regarded as the truest, most absolute edge of everything that mattered, not a frontier to be settled, but the final, undebatable boundary of creation itself. And now there was a galaxy there, a new one, spinning slow and bright and impossibly deliberate in a darkness that had been empty since before any of the Council's founding species had learned to walk upright. Its light only now, after decades of travel across the intervening void, beginning to reach instruments capable of registering that it existed at all. Senior Cartographer Ys'thera Voll of the Vithari Deep Survey Directorate stared at the readout for the better part of an hour, before she permitted herself to consider the one explanation that made every anomalous data point resolve into a coherent picture. Because that explanation required her to accept something her entire civilization had spent a century trying very hard to forget. 98 years earlier, the Galactic Council had passed its harshest sentence in 10 millennia of recorded governance. Not exile to some marginal, forgotten corner of council space, which was a punishment that had at least kept the offending species within reach. Within the reassuring boundaries of the galaxy, the Council had spent so long organizing and controlling, but full and total expulsion. A sentence that stripped humanity not merely of its technology and its standing among the Council's member species, but of its very place within the galaxy itself. Humanity had been loaded onto a fleet of one-way transport vessels and sent, with no hope of return, out past the galaxy's own spiral arms, out past the thinning edge of the disk, out into the true dark between galaxies where no star had ever burned and none. By every law of stellar formation the Council's oldest astronomers understood ever would. The Council had called it, in the clinical language its bureaucracies always reserved for its cruelest decisions, a final severance. Humanity, the tribunal's ruling stated, had proven itself incapable of coexisting within any bounded system of governance. Where other troublesome species could be managed through relocation, through restriction, through the patient application of 10,000 years of institutional authority, humanity had continued, even after repeated warnings and diminished privileges, to behave as though the fundamental architecture of council law was a suggestion rather than a structure questioning treaties that had stood unchallenged for millennia. Proposing alternate systems of resource allocation that threatened the delicate balance the council's elder species had spent ages constructing. And worst of all, succeeding often enough at their unauthorized experiments that other younger species had begun with alarming frequency to ask why they too could not question things the Council had long ago declared settled. A species that could not be contained within the galaxy's order, the tribunal concluded, could not be permitted to remain within the galaxy at all. The sentence had been carried out with the same bloodless efficiency the Council applied to every difficult decision. 9 million humans, all that remained of a species that had once numbered in the tens of billions before Council contact and the century of restrictive quarantine measures that followed it, were loaded onto transport hulls built for exactly one purpose: to carry their occupants beyond the edge of the galaxy and never bring them back. The ships were given no return capability at all, not merely stripped of it as a punitive afterthought but designed from their very keel without it, because the Council's ruling had been explicit that no human vessel should ever again possess the theoretical capacity to make the crossing back into Council space. The journey took 9 years at the sublight speeds the Council permitted their exiled convoy, escorted the Ent. Way by a grim procession of Council monitor ships whose sole purpose was to confirm that the sentence was carried out to its absolute conclusion, that the last human transport crossed the outermost threshold of the galactic disk and continued outward, alone, into a darkness so complete and so total that the Council's own astronomers privately doubted anyone aboard would survive to see its end. The woman who led that fleet into the dark, a former systems engineer named Kaya Rayner, who had been elected by the fractured remnant of humanity's ruling councils to serve as first voice of the Exodus, understood better than almost anyone what the Council's sentence actually meant, because she had spent the final months before the expulsion poring over every scrap of astronomical data her people could access, trying to determine whether there was any possibility, however remote, of the region beyond the galaxy supporting human life. The conclusion she reached, and which she delivered to her people in the last address broadcast before the Council severed humanity's remaining communication links, was as honest as it was devastating. There was no possibility. The intergalactic medium was a near-perfect vacuum, its hydrogen density too sparse by many orders of magnitude to ever collapse into a star under any natural process astronomers understood, its temperature barely above absolute zero, its darkness total and permanent in every direction. Humanity was not being exiled to a hard, hostile frontier the way it once had been sent to the marginal worlds of some forgotten stellar backwater. Humanity was being exiled to a place where the very physics of star formation had never operated, and by every existing model never would. The Council was not asking humanity to survive hardship. The Council was asking humanity to survive a place that had never been meant to hold anything living at all. Kaya Rayner's final words to her people before the Council severed the link were recorded by every ship in the convoy and would be recited in the decades that followed at the opening of every new colony construction, every new stellar forge ignition, every anniversary of what would come to be called, without irony, the founding dark. She said, "They have sent us to a place with no stars because they believe a species cannot exist without one already burning to warm it. They have forgotten, or perhaps they never truly understood, that we have never once in our history waited for a light to be given to us. We have always been the ones who struck the match. Let them have their galaxy of inherited light. We will go into the true dark, and when the match catches, and it will catch, we will not simply survive there. We will build something the light of their own galaxy has never been brave enough to attempt. We will build a galaxy of our own." The 9 years of the outward crossing were, by any measure available to those who lived them, an ordeal that tested the absolute limits of human endurance. The transport hulls, stripped of every non-essential system by Council engineers determined to leave the exiles with nothing beyond the bare minimum required to keep them alive for the duration of the mandated journey, offered little more than recycled air, rationed water, and the crushing, unbroken darkness of a voyage through a region of space with no stars to mark its passage, no familiar constellations to orient a frightened child's eye. Nothing outside the viewports but an absolute and featureless black that many of the older passengers, in journals later preserved in the archives of the civilization that followed, described as a kind of psychological violence in its own right, a darkness so total that some among the convoy began to doubt, despite Kaya Rayner's steady reassurances, whether they were moving through space at all, or whether the Council had simply consigned them to some kind of endless, lightless purgatory from which no destination, however hostile, would ever actually arrive. 600,000 people died during that 9-year crossing, to the same grim litany of causes that always accompanies a desperate, resource-starved passage through the void. Equipment failures that could not be repaired with the meager parts available, illnesses that spread through cramped and poorly ventilated compartments, the countless small catastrophes of a fleet operating at the absolute edge of its structural and logistical tolerances for nearly a decade without any hope of resupply. And beneath the physical toll, there was a deeper wound that the survivors would spend generations trying to properly name. The wound of exile not merely from a place, but from light itself, from the simple, ancient animal comfort of a sky with stars in it. A comfort that every human being who had ever lived, going back to the earliest ancestors who first looked up from some ancient grassland fire, had been able to take for granted. The children born during the crossing were the first humans in the species' entire, recorded history to grow up never once having seen a star. The physical conditions aboard the Exodus fleet during those 9 years defied, in their sheer relentlessness, almost every precedent of hardship in humanity's long and often difficult history. The transport hulls, built to the Council's exacting and deliberately punitive specifications, allocated barely enough volume per passenger to permit sleeping in shifts, an arrangement that became, within the first year of the crossing, simply the ordinary rhythm of life rather than a temporary emergency measure. Water reclamation systems, designed for a fraction of the load actually placed upon them once the true scale of the fleet's population became clear, required constant, exhausting maintenance from engineering crews who worked in rotations that left many of them permanently, quietly exhausted for the better part of a decade. Food came from a combination of algae vats and a strictly rationed store of preserved staples that had been calculated, by the Council's own logistics inspectors, to provide the absolute minimum caloric intake required to sustain human life without technically constituting a violation of the vague humanitarian standards the Council still nominally claimed to uphold even in the act of exiling an entire species to a place with no hope of return. It was the darkness, more than any of these physical hardships, that left the deepest mark on the generation that made the crossing. Human beings, across every culture and every era of their long history before Council contact, had never once lived without a sky that held at least the promise of light in it, the sun by day, the scattered brilliance of stars, and the reflected glow of a moon by night, even in the depths of the harshest winters or the most remote and inhospitable corners of their homeworld. The intergalactic void offered none of that inheritance. It offered a blackness so total and so complete that the fleet's own psychologists, working with what few resources they had to address a mental health crisis that grew more severe with each passing year of the crossing, began to document a condition they termed, in the clinical language of the era, void fatigue, a slow, creeping despair that settled over passengers who had spent too many months at a stretch without ever glimpsing a single point of light beyond the fleet's own dim internal lighting. A despair that in its most severe cases led to a kind of quiet, hollow withdrawal from which some among the Exodus generation never fully recovered. Kaya Rayner herself, in journals recovered from her personal effects long after her death, wrote candidly of nights during the crossing when she found herself standing at the observation viewport of the flagship, staring into a darkness that offered no landmark, no horizon, no evidence that the universe beyond the hull contained anything at all, and wondering whether she had led her people not into exile, but into a kind of oblivion from which the very concept of a future might never emerge. That she and the people who followed her found the strength to keep moving through those years of total darkness, to keep the fleet systems running, to keep its children educated, to keep its engineers working on problems that offered no guarantee of ever bearing fruit, remains, in the estimation of every historian who has studied the era since, one of the most remarkable sustained acts of collective human resolve ever recorded. It was not born of any single dramatic act of heroism, but of 10,000 small, unglamorous acts of endurance repeated daily across 9 years by people who had every reasonable justification to give up and did not. Engineers who kept recalibrating failing life support systems long past the point of exhaustion, teachers who kept holding lessons for children who had never seen a star and might never see one, parents who kept telling stories about a homeworld most of them would never see again, simply because a child needed something to hold onto besides the dark. When the convoy finally reached the coordinates the Council's sentence had specified, a designated point in intergalactic space roughly 200,000 light-years beyond the edge of the galactic disk, far enough that even the combined light of the entire Council-controlled galaxy behind them had dimmed to a faint, smeared band on the horizon of their sensors. The Council escort ships performed one final act of their mandate. They confirmed, through a battery of increasingly redundant sensor sweeps, that the human convoy had no functioning means of return, no hyperlane transponder capable of being tracked or recalled, no propulsion system with the range to make the crossing back even if some future engineering miracle restored their navigational capability. Then, without any further communication, they turned and departed, leaving 8,400,000 dread thousand survivors, the remainder of the 9,000,000 who had begun the crossing, alone in a darkness more complete than any human being in the history of the species had ever been asked to endure. What the Council did not know, and would not learn for another 89 years, was that Kaya Rayner had smuggled aboard the flagship of the Exodus convoy, something the Council's confiscation inspectors had failed entirely to identify as significant. A small, unassuming data core containing the complete theoretical framework of a research program that had been quietly pursued, in the years before the expulsion, by a reclusive human astrophysicist named Dr. Amara Solis, who had spent the better part of 2 decades studying an obscure and largely dismissed theoretical proposal for inducing artificial gravitational collapse in diffuse interstellar and intergalactic hydrogen using precisely tuned resonant field arrays. The Council's own scientific establishment had examined an early, incomplete version of Solis's work decades earlier, during a period of limited technical cooperation before relations between the Council and humanity had fully soured, and had dismissed it. In the same dispassionate, institutionally confident language, the Council reserved for any idea that threatened to unsettle 10,000 years of established astrophysical consensus as an elegant but practically meaningless curiosity. Star formation, the Council's astronomers held, was a process governed by gravity acting across timescales of millions of years upon clouds of hydrogen already dense enough, by pure cosmic chance, to begin their own collapse. The notion that a spacefaring civilization might deliberately manufacture the conditions for stellar ignition, compressing that natural million-year process into something that could be engineered and controlled on a timescale of mere decades, was considered by the Council's oldest and most respected scientific minds to belong somewhere between ambitious fantasy and outright hubris. Dr. Solis had died during the crossing, one of the 600,000 lost to the ordeal of the Exodus, succumbing to a respiratory illness that a fully equipped medical bay would have treated in an afternoon, but that the stripped and rationed conditions of the transport fleet left with no adequate remedy. She did not live to see whether her life's work, painstakingly preserved on that smuggled data core, would ever amount to anything beyond a grieving footnote in the story of humanity's final, hopeless exile. But the framework she left behind became, in the decades that followed, the single most consequential inheritance any human being had ever passed to their descendants, and it fell to a young engineer named Torin Vashti, barely 19 years old at the time of the expulsion, one of the last generation of humans who could still remember faintly what starlight had looked like from the surface of a living world, to take up the burden of proving that Amara Solis had been right, and that the Council's 10,000 years of confident astrophysical consensus had been, in this one crucial respect, catastrophically wrong. The first decade after the Exodus fleet reached its final coordinates was devoted almost entirely to bare survival, a grim and unglamorous struggle that in many ways mirrored the darkest chapters of every human exile that had come before it, except stripped even of the meager comforts a hostile planet's gravity and atmosphere might have offered. There was no world to land on. There was no ground to till, no atmosphere to breathe, no ambient starlight to warm a hull even slightly. The survivors lived entirely within their fleet of transport vessels, now anchored together in a loose defensive cluster that came to be called, with the particular grim humor humanity had always reserved for its darkest circumstances, the hearth, A name chosen precisely because it described the one thing their situation most conspicuously lacked. Power came from the fleet's dwindling fusion reserves, carefully rationed fuel that had been calculated by the Exodus's own grim engineering assessments to sustain minimal life support for perhaps 30 more years before the last reactor finally guttered out and 8 million people died together in a darkness with no possibility of rescue, because there was no one left in the universe who might come looking. It was against this ticking, existential deadline that Torin Vashti and the small team of physicists and engineers he assembled scavenged, in the fleet's own internal parlance, from whatever surviving expertise the Exodus convoy still possessed, began the work of trying to turn Amara Solis' theoretical framework into something that could actually save them. The core insight of Solis' research, as Vashti and his team painstakingly reconstructed and extended it over years of trial and catastrophic error, was that the vast, diffuse hydrogen of the intergalactic Ike medium, though far too sparse to ever collapse into a star through any natural process, could in principle be gathered, concentrated, and compressed by an artificial gravitational lensing field generated through a carefully tuned resonance architecture. Not unlike, in its most basic conceptual shape, the way a magnifying glass gathers scattered sunlight into a single searing point, except operating not on light but on the fundamental fabric of spacetime itself. Coaxing scattered atoms across a volume of space measured in light years into a slow, converging spiral that would, if the field could be sustained long enough and precisely enough, eventually achieve the density and pressure necessary to ignite genuine stellar fusion. The theoretical elegance of the idea belied the almost unimaginable engineering challenge of actually realizing it. The first 11 years of experimentation produced nothing but failure after failure fields that destabilized before achieving meaningful compression, resonance patterns that dissipated their gathered hydrogen back into the void the moment the generating array's power fluctuated even slightly, failures that very nearly convinced the fleet's ruling council to abandon the entire program as an unaffordable drain on their few remaining resources. Torin Vashti, then barely 30 years old and already carrying the particular weight of having inherited a dead woman's unfinished dream, argued before that same ruling council that abandoning the work was not a path to safety, but merely a slower, quieter version of the same death the reactor's failing fuel reserves already promised. Humanity had been sent into the dark on the explicit theory that nothing could live there without a star already provided. If that theory was correct, they were already dead, and continuing to husband their dwindling fuel would only delay an inevitable ending by a handful of extra years. If the theory was wrong, if a star could, in fact, be made rather than merely found, then the work was not a drain on their survival. It was the only path to survival that existed at all. The engineering challenge Torin Vashti inherited was compounded by a problem that went beyond the raw physics of gravitational compression. The resonance arrays required to generate a field strong and stable enough to gather and compress intergalactic hydrogen demanded a scale of construction that dwarfed anything the fleet's limited industrial base had been designed to produce. The original transport hulls, stripped by council engineers of every non-essential system before the expulsion, possessed only the most rudimentary fabrication equipment, intended for minor in-flight repairs rather than the kind of large-scale structural engineering that a functioning stellar forge would require. Vashti's team spent the first several years of the project not on the resonance physics itself, but on the considerably less glamorous work of building the industrial capacity to build the thing that would eventually build a star, disassembling redundant sections of the fleet's own transport hulls, salvaging every scrap of usable metal and composite material, and slowly, painstakingly constructing a fabrication yard capable of producing components at the scale the project demanded. It was, in its own quiet way, as significant an achievement as the stellar ignition that followed, though it received far less attention in the historical record, precisely because it lacked the singular, dramatic moment of triumph that a first star's ignition naturally provided. The catastrophic containment failure in the 12th year of the project, which claimed 43 lives, occurred when an early resonance array, pushed beyond its structural tolerances in an attempt to accelerate the compression timeline, experienced a cascading field collapse that tore through its own support structure and the surrounding habitat modules with a violence that the fleet's survivors, many of whom had lost friends and family in the disaster, described afterward as the single darkest moment of the entire exodus, darker, in its way, than the crossing itself, because it arrived after hope had finally begun to take root and threatened to extinguish that hope entirely just as it was beginning to grow. Torin Vashti, then still a relatively junior member of the project's leadership, spent the weeks following the disaster in what his own private letters describe as a state of near-total collapse, convinced that his stewardship of Amara Solis' inheritance had cost 43 more lives for nothing, that the entire theoretical framework was a beautiful and ultimately fatal delusion. It was, by his own later account, a message from one of the disaster's survivors, a woman named Priya Okonkwo Vashti, who had lost her husband in the containment failure and who would, years later, become Torin Vashti's own partner and closest collaborator, that convinced him to continue. She told him, in a letter he kept for the rest of his life, and which was later reproduced in the founding archive of the Second Light, that grief was not a reason to stop building the thing her husband had died trying to build, and that the truest way to honor those the project had already cost was to make absolutely certain their deaths were not the end of the story, but merely its hardest and most necessary chapter. The resonance architecture that finally succeeded, 7 years after that disaster, differed from the earlier failed designs in a crucial respect. Rather than attempting to generate a single monolithic compression field from one central array, Vashti's redesigned system distributed the gravitational lensing effect across a coordinated network of smaller, more stable arrays, each individually less powerful but collectively capable of sustaining a far more precisely controlled and gradually intensifying compression field than any single structure could safely maintain. It was, in its underlying philosophy, a distinctly human solution to the problem, not the pursuit of overwhelming, singular force, but the patient coordination of many smaller, more resilient elements working in concert, an approach that would come to define nearly every subsequent phase of the Second Light's construction. From the arrangement of its stellar lattice down to the governance, structures its citizens eventually built to manage a civilization spanning hundreds of billions of engineered stars. The Council had granted Vashti 5 more years to prove his work could succeed. It took him 7, and the fleet's fuel reserves had shrunk to barely 18 months of margin by the time his team finally achieved, in a triumph as quiet and technically unglamorous as Amara Solis' own earliest experiments had once been in a converted cargo hold a lifetime and a galaxy away. The first sustained gravitational compression of intergalactic hydrogen into a coherent, self-reinforcing collapse. It began as nothing more than a faint thickening of the near-total vacuum surrounding the fleet's largest resonance array, a change so subtle that only the most sensitive instruments could register it at all. But it did not dissipate. Hour by hour, day by day, the compressed cloud of hydrogen continued to draw inward under the sustained pull of the artificial field, thickening, warming, its density climbing by infinitesimal degrees toward the threshold that would, if the models held, eventually ignite fusion at its core. It took another 4 years of patient, unbroken vigilance, of constant field recalibration and increasingly desperate power rationing, as the fleet diverted every spare erg of energy toward sustaining the compression, before the moment finally arrived that would be remembered, for as long as any record of humanity's exile survived, as the true beginning of everything that followed. The moment the gathered cloud's core crossed the threshold of its own gravity, and a star that had never existed before, that had been willed into being by nothing but human stubbornness and 18 years of relentless engineering, ignited in the true dark for the first time. The light that reached the hearth's viewports in that moment was, by any objective astronomical measure, an extraordinarily modest thing, a young, dim protostar barely beginning the long process of stellar maturation, its output a pale fraction of what a fully matured star would eventually produce. But to the 8 million people who had spent nearly 3 decades living in a darkness so complete that an entire generation of children had grown up never having seen a star at all, that first faint point of manufactured light, glimpsed through the reinforced viewports of a fleet that had been sentenced to die exactly where it now floated, provoked a reaction that the fleet's own historical archives describe, without any trace of exaggeration, as something closer to a religious experience than a scientific milestone. People who had never seen a star wept at the sight of one. Elderly survivors of the original crossing, who remembered what starlight had looked like on a living world and had long ago made a private peace with the belief they would die without ever seeing it again, held their grandchildren up to the viewports and told them, for the first time in any of those children's lives, a story about a place called home that suddenly felt, for the first time since the Exodus began, like something that might actually be rebuilt rather than merely mourned. Torin Vashti did not permit himself or his people to treat that first star as an ending. It was, he insisted in the address he gave to the fleet in the days after the ignition, only the beginning of the true work, proof of concept for a project that would need to be repeated not once, but thousands upon thousands of times if humanity intended to build not merely a single point of light to orbit in the dark, but an entire new home structure. Dead and stable and self-sustaining across the scale of a genuine stellar system, and ultimately across the scale of something far larger still. It took another 6 years to stabilize the fleet's first star into full maturity and to construct, from salvaged transport hull materials and the first products of the new star's own energy output, the fleet's first permanent orbital habitats, modest structures at first, barely more sophisticated than the domes the earlier generation of human exiles had once built on the marginal worlds of the Council's designated dark. But built this time around a star that belonged to no one but the people who had made it, in a system that existed on no Council chart, because it had not existed at all until human hands had willed it into being. From that first star, the project accelerated with the particular compounding momentum that comes from a civilization that has finally proven, to its own complete satisfaction, that the thing it once thought impossible is not merely possible but repeatable. Each successive stellar ignition benefited from the accumulated engineering knowledge of every ignition that had come before it, and the resonance arrays themselves grew larger, more efficient, and more numerous as humanity's small industrial base, now finally freed from the existential terror of imminent fuel exhaustion, began converting an ever larger share of its energy and material resources toward the singular generational project that Torin Vashti by then recognized. Whether he had sought the title or not, as the founding architect of humanity's new home, had first articulated in that desperate address to the ruling council decades earlier, not merely to survive in the space the council had exiled them to, but to fill that space systematically and deliberately with a structure of stars arranged not by the blind, patient chance of natural gravitational collapse across 100 million years, but by careful, considered human design. By the 40th year after the Exodus, the region of space around the hearth held not one star but 11, arranged in a slowly expanding lattice that Vashti's successors, drawing on advanced orbital mechanics and a design philosophy that valued long-term stability and habitability over any purely aesthetic consideration, had begun shaping with deliberate intention into something that would, if continued at scale across centuries, resemble nothing so much as a genuine spiral galaxy in miniature, a galaxy-built star by engineered star, with an internal logic and structural coherence that no naturally formed galaxy, shaped by billions of years of chaotic gravitational happenstance, could ever quite replicate. By the 60th year, the count had grown to over 4,000 stars, and the first fully terraformed worlds planets assembled, in a further extension of the same underlying stellar engineering principles. From carefully directed accretion of gathered interstellar material rather than found and adapted, as the Council's model of colonization had always assumed necessary, had begun supporting human populations who had never known any other home, who had been born and raised entirely within a civilization whose every star and every world existed because their ancestors had built it, rather than merely discovered it. The decades that separated that first tentative ignition from the sprawling, deliberate structure the threshold array's sensors would eventually detect were not, contrary to the tidy narrative that later popular retellings sometimes preferred, a simple, uninterrupted march of triumph. Each new stellar ignition brought its own novel engineering challenges, and the further the expanding lattice grew from the original Hearth cluster, the more complex the coordination problem became. Resonance arrays now separated by light years rather than mere kilometers, requiring communication and control systems that had to be invented essentially from scratch, since no existing human technology inherited from before the expulsion or improvised during it had ever needed to synchronize operations across such staggering distances with such exacting precision. The 40th star in the lattice, ignited some 22 years after the first, required an entirely new generation of coordination protocols developed by a young systems architect named Bainam Farrokh Vashti, grandson of Torin Vashti's original chief engineer, whose contribution to the project an elegant, self-correcting network architecture that allowed hundreds and eventually thousands of individual resonance arrays to adjust their output in real time based on the gravitational feedback of their neighbors, would prove as essential to the second light's eventual scale as the original compression breakthrough itself, though his name remained, for decades, known only within the fleet's own engineering circles rather than celebrated alongside the more mythologized figures of Raynor Solis. And Vashti. The habitats and worlds that grew up around each new star followed a pattern of deliberate, careful design that reflected the hard lessons of the Exodus generation as clearly as any technical schematic. Where the Council's own colonization philosophy had always assumed the discovery and adaptation of naturally occurring worlds, planets found already possessing at least the raw materials of habitability, however hostile, which colonists then labored to render survivable. The architects of the Second Light approached world building with an entirely different premise, since the stars they were creating possessed, at first, no planets at all. The techniques developed to solve this problem, extending the same underlying principles of directed gravitational accretion that had first been used to gather and compress interstellar hydrogen into stellar cores, allowed engineers to guide the formation of planetary bodies with a precision no natural process could ever match. Worlds built with exactly the axial tilt, exactly the orbital distance, exactly the composition of atmosphere and crust that their designers determined would best support the particular kind of community intended to live there. The first fully engineered world, a modest, temperate planet named Solace in honor of Amara Solis, entered stable orbit around the Hearth's second star some 31 years after the Exodus began, and its careful, deliberate design, gentle seasons, abundant fresh water, a night sky arranged in a gesture the world's original settlers found unbearably moving, to include a faint, visible band that marked the direction of the ancient homeworld none of them would ever see, set the template for the hundreds of thousands of worlds that would eventually follow it across the growing structure of the Second Light. By the time the third generation born entirely within the new galaxy reached adulthood, the culture of the Second Light had developed a character distinctly its own, shaped by an inheritance that was neither purely the inherited memory of a lost homeworld nor purely the harsh necessity of the Exodus years, but something new that emerged from the particular experience of building, quite literally, an entire civilization from first principles. Education across the Second Light placed unusual emphasis, by the standards of most spacefaring cultures the Council had ever catalogued, on the history of the Exodus itself, not merely as a matter of cultural memory, but as a kind of foundational civic instruction, ensuring that every citizen, regardless of how comfortable and secure their own upbringing among the now abundant stars of the lattice might be, understood precisely what had been sacrificed and risked to make that comfort possible. Public monuments across the Second Light's earliest worlds tended toward a shared aesthetic vocabulary that outside observers, once contact with the Council resumed, found simultaneously stark and deeply moving. Modest, unadorned structures marking the sites of early disasters and early triumphs alike, inscribed not with grand declarations of glory, but with the names, wherever they could be recovered, of every individual lost along the way. The 600,000 of the crossing, the 43 of the containment failure, and the thousands more who died in the smaller, less mythologized catastrophes of a century spent building civilization from nothing in a place where nothing had ever been meant to exist. This was, in the estimation of several Council anthropologists who studied the Second Light in the decades following first contact, the single most striking cultural distinction between the two civilizations. Where the Council's 10,000-year history had gradually smoothed its own harshest chapters into comfortable, sanitized institutional memory, the culture of the Second Light insisted, with what outside observers sometimes found an almost uncomfortable intensity, on remembering its cost in full and specific detail, generation after generation. As though the act of forgetting even a single name from the ledger of what the Exodus had demanded would somehow cheapen everything that had been built from that sacrifice. That so troubled cartographer Ys'thera Voll, 98 years after the final severance, the structure floating in the once empty dark beyond the edge of the Council's galaxy had grown to encompass. According to the survey data, the Council's astronomers would spend the following weeks frantically trying to verify and re-verify because the numbers seemed too vast to credit. Some 340 billion stars, organized into 4 sweeping spiral arms around a dense, brilliantly engineered galactic core, its structure so precise, so deliberately balanced in its distribution of stellar mass and orbital mechanics, that it achieved a degree of internal gravitational stability no naturally formed galaxy in the Council's entire catalogued survey of the KN. Own universe had ever managed to sustain. It did not merely exist. It gleamed with a kind of architectural perfection that made the Council's own galaxy magnificent, ancient, and utterly unplanned look, by comparison, like a beautiful accident standing beside a work of deliberate art. Word of the discovery reached the Council's ruling assembly within days, and the reaction, once the initial disbelief gave way to grim comprehension of what the survey data actually meant, was a species of institutional panic that the Council's oldest members had not experienced since the earliest, most uncertain days of the Council's founding, 10,000 years before. A species they had sentenced to die in the true dark, certain beyond any reasonable scientific doubt that no civilization could persist, let alone flourish, in a region of space with no stars and no prospect of ever acquiring any, had not merely survived. It had spent a single century, a rounding error, by the patient reckoning of the Council's elder species, building an entire second galaxy from nothing, a feat of stellar engineering so far beyond anything the Council's own 10,000-year scientific tradition had ever attempted that its oldest and most celebrated astrophysicists could not, even now, fully explain the underlying mechanism by which it had been accomplished. The Council's first instinct, born of the same institutional confidence that had shaped its response to every challenge to its authority across 10 millennia of unbroken rule, was to treat the discovery as a threat requiring immediate and overwhelming military assessment. A reconnaissance fleet was dispatched toward the coordinates of the new structure, its official mandate couched in the careful diplomatic language of a fact-finding mission, but its actual composition, nearly 300 of the Council's most advanced warships, drawn from every major member species' naval reserves, leaving little doubt among anyone who studied the deployment orders that the Council intended at minimum to remind the returned exiles of exactly how large a gap in raw military power still separated a century-old human civilization from 10,000 years of accumulated council might, whatever miracles of stellar engineering they had managed to achieve. It took the reconnaissance fleet 6 years, traveling at the very edge of Council hyperlane capability across the vast intergalactic gulf, to reach the outer perimeter of the new galaxy, and what its sensor operators found waiting for them there, arrayed in a loose, unhurried formation along the structure's outermost spiral arm, was a welcoming committee that could not have communicated its intentions more clearly if it had tried. Perhaps 200 human vessels, built along an aesthetic philosophy that bore only the faintest ancestral resemblance to the salvaged, improvised hulls of the original Exodus fleet, sleek, radiant structures whose hulls seemed to have been grown from crystallized starlight itself, drawing power directly from the engineered stars around them and radiating it back outward in slow, deliberate pulses that read, to any sensor trained to interpret such things, less as a threat display and more as a simple, unbothered statement of presence. They did not move to intercept the Council fleet. They did not power weapons or raise defensive fields. They simply waited, arrayed along the boundary of the galaxy their ancestors had built from nothing, with the calm, unhurried patience of a people who understood, with total and unshakable certainty, that they had already won whatever contest the Council had come intending to have. The human vessel that finally moved to meet the Council delegation, a slender flagship of luminous white and gold that its crew had named, in a gesture that would not be lost on anyone who later learned the story, the Amara Solis, carried aboard it a woman named Ilsa Vashti Rayner, great-granddaughter of both Torin Vashti and Kaya Rayner, whose lineage the Council's own genealogical archives still meticulously maintained from the era before the expulsion. Confirmed within hours of receiving her identification transmission. She was, at the time of that first contact, 61 years old, chancellor of a human civilization that had grown, across a single century of engineered stellar expansion, to number nearly 4 billion citizens spread across worlds that existed nowhere in any Council star chart, because the Council's astronomers had not yet finished the difficult, humbling work of mapping a galaxy they had once been certain could never exist at all. Her message to the Council fleet, transmitted on an open frequency that ensured every ship in the reconnaissance force, and within hours, every citizen of Council space who monitored such broadcasts would hear it in full, was considerably shorter than the address her grandmother's grandmother had once delivered above the Council's crystal spire, and it carried, by design, none of the practiced diplomatic warmth that speech had offered. You sent us into the dark on the theory that nothing could live there without a star already given to it, she said. We have spent a century proving that theory wrong, one star at a time. We do not come armed because we have no need of weapons to make our point. We do not come asking for reinstatement to your Council, because we have built something your Council in 10,000 years of existence never once attempted. A galaxy of our own, built entirely on the terms we chose for ourselves without your permission and without your approval. You are welcome to study what we have built. You are welcome to trade with us if you have anything of value left to offer a civilization that has learned to manufacture its own stars. But you should understand, clearly and permanently, that the era in which the Council could sentence a species to non-existence simply by removing it from the boundaries of your comfortable, ancient galaxy has ended. There is more than one galaxy in this universe capable of holding a living civilization. We intend to make sure no one who comes after us is ever again allowed to forget that fact. The Council reconnaissance fleet did not engage. There was, in truth, little for it to engage against, since the human welcoming force made no aggressive move of any kind, content simply to escort the Council ships to the edge of a small, carefully designated observation zone near the new galaxy's outer rim, where representatives of the Council's scientific establishment were permitted, under close human supervision, to study, though never fully replicate, The engineering principles behind the stellar forges that had built an entire galaxy from nothing but hydrogen, patience, and the accumulated stubbornness of 3 generations, who had refused to accept that a place with no stars was a place with no future. The reconnaissance fleet's commanding officer, a Vathari admiral named Corvith Ashelin, who had spent the better part of his long career commanding ceremonial patrols along the Council's most peaceful and least eventful border regions, found the 6-year journey toward the coordinates of the new galaxy to be the most psychologically taxing deployment of his entire service record, though the fleet encountered no hostile action of any kind along the way. It was, he later wrote in a memoir published after his retirement, the sheer scale of what his instruments continued to confirm week after week, that wore at him most the growing certainty as the fleet drew closer and the new galaxy's light resolved into ever sharper and more undeniable detail, that whatever they found waiting at the end of the journey would not be some modest human settlement clinging to survival in the dark, but a fully realized civilization that had, in the span of a single century, accomplished something the combined scientific establishments of every council member species, across 10,000 years of study, had never so much as attempted. He recorded in the ship's log on the day his sensors finally resolved individual stars within the new structure rather than merely its aggregate luminous mass, a single line that would later be quoted with a certain rueful irony throughout council academic circles. We came expecting to find survivors. We are approaching what can only be described, by any honest reckoning, as a rival. The scientific delegation that eventually accompanied the reconnaissance fleet's diplomatic follow-up mission, granted limited access to observe the outer structure of the Second Light stellar forges under the careful supervision Ilsa Vashti Rayner's government insisted upon, returned to Council space with data that took the Council's astrophysical establishment the better part of a decade to even begin to properly digest, and which prompted, within the Council's own most prestigious scientific academies, a period of genuine institutional reckoning unlike anything recorded in 10,000 years of comfortable consensus. The resonance architecture Torin Vashti and his successors had spent a century refining bore almost no resemblance to any propulsion or energy technology in the Council's existing scientific canon, precisely because it had been developed by researchers who possessed no inherited assumptions about what such technology was supposed to look like. No 10,000-year tradition of established practice constraining the shape of their experimentation. Where council physics had spent millennia organizing itself around a settled hierarchical understanding of which phenomena were fundamental and which were mere curiosities, human researchers, freed by desperation from any such inherited hierarchy, had simply followed the evidence wherever it led, building an entirely parallel scientific tradition from principles the council's own academies had dismissed centuries earlier as unworthy of serious study. Although Jane, rations that followed that first contact reshaped the relationship between the two galaxies into something far more complicated and far more consequential than either simple rivalry or simple reconciliation. The Council, humbled in a way it had not been humbled in 10,000 years of institutional history, could not simply dismiss what humanity had built, because the evidence of it burned visibly in the night sky of every world in Council space. A new and growing point of light on the cosmic horizon that grew brighter year by year, as humanity's engineered galaxy continued its steady, deliberate expansion. Diplomatic relations, when they finally resumed on terms the human federation itself dictated rather than terms the Council imposed, proceeded with a caution and a mutual respect that had never characterized humanity's original, doomed relationship with Council authority. Trade began cautiously in both directions, the Council offering access to ancient knowledge and cultural archives accumulated across 10 millennia, humanity offering, with considerable more reluctance and considerably more restriction, limited insight into stellar engineering principles that every younger species in the Council quietly desperately hoped might one day allow them to build their own way out from under the shadow of powers who had ruled over them since before their own recorded history began. Among the Council's own younger member species, the political consequences of the discovery proved, in the years that followed, to be considerably more destabilizing to the old order than any military confrontation could have been. The ferric trading consortiums, whose entire economic model depended on nimble adaptation to shifting opportunity, were the first to formally establish independent trade contact with the Second Light, dispatching envoys within 18 months of the Council's own official first contact, and their success in negotiating limited access to human water reclamation technology, considerably less strategically sensitive than the stellar forges themselves. But still decades ahead of anything the Council's own engineers had developed, triggered a wave of similar diplomatic overtures from a dozen other younger species, who had spent centuries watching the Council's eldest members hoard the most transformative technologies for themselves, under the perpetual justification that younger civilizations were not yet responsible enough to be trusted with them. The Dune Academic Compact, whose entire cultural identity rested on a reputation for rigorous, patient scholarship, found itself in the uncomfortable position of watching its most celebrated astrophysicists struggle for years to even partially reconstruct principles that human engineers, working with a fraction of the Dune's institutional resources, had derived from first principles in a matter of decades under the most desperate imaginable circumstances. It was this quiet, cascading erosion of the Council's presumed monopoly on advanced knowledge, more than any single dramatic confrontation, more even than the sheer scale of the Second Light itself, that Council historians would later identify as the true beginning of the long, gradual restructuring of galactic governance that unfolded across the century following first contact. The old hierarchy had rested at its foundation on an assumption so deeply embedded that it had rarely needed to be stated explicitly, that the Council's eldest species possessed not merely more accumulated knowledge than their younger counterparts, but a kind of settled, permanent wisdom that time alone could confer, and that no upstart civilization, however clever, could realistically hope to challenge within any span of time short of many centuries. Humanity's return, bearing not merely a demonstration of clever engineering, but an entire second galaxy built in open, undeniable defiance of that assumption, did not merely embarrass the Council's eldest members. It called into question the entire premise on which their authority over the galaxy's younger species had always ultimately rested, and once that premise had been publicly and irrefutably broken, no amount of careful diplomatic messaging from the Council's oldest institutions could fully restore it. Senior Cartographer Ys'thera Voll, whose long-forgotten sensor readings had first registered the impossible signature that began this entire cascade of consequence, was invited, in recognition of her role in the discovery, to join the first permanent Council observation mission stationed at the edge of the Second Light, a posting she held for the remaining 30 years of her long professional career. In the memoir she eventually published, written in the measured, careful prose typical of Ys'thera's scholarly tradition, she reflected that her greatest surprise, across 3 decades of studying humanity's engineered galaxy up close, was not the technology itself, remarkable as it remained even after decades of careful study, but the particular quality of confidence she observed among the citizens of the Second Light, a confidence that carried none of the brittle defensiveness she had expected from a people who had once been cast out and left for dead, and none of the triumphant vindictiveness she had privately feared might animate a civilization that had by any reasonable measure more than earned the right to a certain amount of righteous anger. What she found instead, again and again, in conversations with human citizens across dozens of the Second Light's worlds, was something closer to a settled, unhurried certainty, the quiet confidence of a people who had already proven, to their own complete satisfaction and to no one else's approval they still felt any need to seek, exactly what they were capable of building when the entire universe told them it could not be done. Ilsa Vashti governed the new human galaxy, which its own citizens had taken, in the years following first contact, to calling simply the Second Light, a name chosen in deliberate, quiet defiance of every council assumption about what a species exiled into total darkness was supposed to become for another 3 decades. Watching it grow from 4 billion citizens across a still expanding lattice of engineered stars into a civilization whose full extent even its own astronomers struggled to fully catalog. She died eventually, as all humans do, in a modest habitat orbiting the very first star her great-grandfather had coaxed into existence from nothing but hydrogen and desperate mathematics. Her passing was marked across the worlds of the Second Light, not with the elaborate state funerals the Council reserved for its own departed leaders, but with a simpler, more distinctly human observance that had grown out of the Exodus generation's own funeral customs. A single day of silence across every inhabited world, during which no ship's engine fired and no construction array hummed, so that for one full rotation of every world in the lattice, the only light moving through the Second Light's sky was the light of the stars themselves, burning steady and unhurried in testament to everything that had been built to hold them. Her granddaughter, who succeeded her as Chancellor and who would herself go on to oversee the negotiation of the Second Light's first formal, if carefully limited, treaty of mutual recognition with the Council some years later, said in the address she gave at that observance that her grandmother had never once, in all the years she had known her, spoken of the exile as a tragedy that had simply been survived. She had spoken of it always as the raw material from which something extraordinary had been deliberately, patiently made. And she had insisted, until the very end of her long life, that the true measure of what humanity had accomplished was not the size of the galaxy they had built, staggering as that size undeniably was, but the fact that not one of the fires still burning across its hundreds of billions of engineered stars had ever needed anyone's permission to be lit. It was a lesson, the new Chancellor added, that she intended to carry into every negotiation the Second Light would ever conduct with the Council or with any other power that might, in some distant future, look upon a younger civilization and mistake its present limitations for its permanent shape. And the final entry in the private journal she left behind, later published as part of the Second Light's founding archive, offered no grand pronouncement of triumph, no final assertion of vindication over the civilization that had once tried to erase her people from existence by sending them somewhere no star could ever reach them. It said only this: they believed that light was something a species either inherited or went without. We have spent a century proving that light, like everything else worth having, can be built by anyone determined enough to strike the first match in the dark and keep striking it, for as long as it takes, until the fire finally catches and refuses ever again to go out. There is a particular ritual observed on Solace, the first fully engineered world of the Second Light, that visiting council delegations have come, over the decades since first contact, to regard as the single most affecting tradition anywhere in human space, precisely because of how completely it inverts the assumptions the Council once held about what exile to that world's origin point was supposed to mean. On the anniversary of the Exodus each year, families across Solace gather at dusk, as they have for generations, to watch the sky's faint band of light that marks the direction of the long-lost homeworld none of the current generation has ever seen, and to recite together, in a tradition passed down unbroken since the earliest years of the hearth, the names of everyone lost along the way, not only the great architects W.H. O's names survive in the history books, but every ordinary citizen the archive has managed to preserve, read aloud in full regardless of how many hours the complete recitation requires. Because the culture of the Second Light has always insisted that a civilization's true measure lies not in what it chooses to celebrate, but in what it refuses to let itself forget. The Council's own attempts to explain what had happened, in the formal historical assessments its scholars produced across the decades following first contact, tended to circle around a single, uncomfortable admission that few of its authors were willing to state as plainly as Ys'thera Voll eventually did in her own retirement memoir. That the Council had mistaken the absence of a star for the absence of possibility, and had done so not through any excusable failure of instrumentation or foresight, but through the deeper, more consequential error of assuming that the boundaries it had drawn around what a civilization could become were boundaries written into the fabric of the universe itself. Rather than boundaries, the Council had simply never been desperate enough, or humble enough, or young enough in spirit to think of questioning. Humanity, exiled precisely because it had never learned to accept a boundary simply because an older and more powerful institution had declared it permanent, proved in the most literal and cosmically vast terms imaginable that the boundary the Council had chosen to banish them beyond had never been a wall at all. It had only ever been the edge of what the Council itself, in 10,000 years of comfortable and unchallenged rule, had been willing to imagine. Today, if you stand on any world within Council space and look up into a clear night sky, you can find it, if you know precisely where to look, a faint, steady smear of light on the very edge of visibility, growing very slowly brighter with each passing generation as the engineered stars of the second light continue their patient, deliberate multiplication across a darkness that was once declared, with total scientific confidence, permanently and irrevocably empty. The Council's astronomers have a formal designation for it now, a careful, technical name recorded in their star catalogs alongside 10,000 years of naturally formed galactic structures. But among the younger species of the Council, the ones who remember what it felt like to be told the boundaries of what they were allowed to become, and who have spent a century now watching a species once sentenced to non-existence answer that judgment not with vengeance, but with an entire second galaxy of its own patient, engineered making. It is known, in every language spoken across 100 worlds, by a simpler and more defiant name. The galaxy that should not exist, built by the people who were told they should not either. And on clear nights across the worlds of the second light, where the Council's own ancient galaxy appears now only as a distant, unremarkable smear on the opposite horizon, human children are taught to find that same faint light and told, before they are old enough to fully understand what the story means, that it once belonged to the people who believed a species could be measured entirely by the darkness they were sent into, rather than by the light they were determined, against every reasonable expectation, to build.